Good morning, Aliza. I'm so thrilled to have you join me today. Thanks for taking the time to speak, and would love to ask you about your personal story and how it motivated you to start the Legal Accountability Project.
Sure. So thanks for having me on the show. I decided to serve as a law clerk in DC Superior Court during the 2019 to 2020 term because I aspired to be a homicide prosecutor in the DC U.S. Attorney's Office. I knew that DC prosecutors appeared before DC judges. The messaging at my law school, WashU Law, was uniformly positive, that this would be a lifelong mentor-mentee relationship, that I should apply broadly, meaning across the country, across the political spectrum, except the first clerkship I was offered. So I did those things. Unfortunately, beginning just weeks into that clerkship, I began to face gender discrimination and harassment by the judge for whom I clerked. He would kick me out of the courtroom, tell me that I made him uncomfortable, and he just felt more comfortable with my male co-clerk. He told me I was bossy, aggressive, nasty, a disappointment. Day I found out that I passed the DC bar exam. So pretty big day in any young attorney's life.
Yeah.
He called me into his chambers, got in my face and said, "You're bossy." And I know bossy because my wife is bossy. And I was just devastated. I mean, this was my first legal job. I was a couple months out of law school. And this judge just seemed to be singling me out for mistreatment. I remember crying myself to sleep at night, crying on the walk to work in the morning, wishing I could be reassigned to a different judge for the rest of the clerkship. My workplace in the DC courts didn't have an employee dispute resolution or EDR plan that might have enabled me to be reassigned. I confided in some mentors who advised me to stick it out, so I tried to. We transitioned to remote work in March of 2020 during the pandemic, moved back to Philly to stay with my parents and work remotely. And the judge basically ignored me for 6 weeks before he called me up in late April 2020, told me he was ending my clerkship early because I made him uncomfortable and lacked respect for him, but he didn't want to get into it. Then he hung up on me. So I called DC Courts HR, and they told me there was nothing they could do. HR doesn't regulate judges. Judges and law clerks have a unique relationship. Then they asked me whether I knew that I was an at-will employee. So I reached out to my law school, WashU Law in St. Louis, for advice, support, assistance. Found out this judge had a history of misconduct that several law school officials, a couple professors, and the clerkships director knew about at the time I'd accepted the clerkship, but decided not to share with me because I guess they wanted another student to clerk. So that was pretty devastating on top of everything else that was happening. And it took me about a year to get back on my feet. I applied for jobs, but it was a red flag that I didn't list my previous supervisor as a reference. It was a red flag that my clerkship had ended early. I eventually did secure my dream job in the DC U.S. Attorney's Office, and I moved back to DC in the summer of 2021, intending to launch my career as a homicide prosecutor. And I was 2 weeks into training at the DC U.S. Attorney's Office in July of 2021 when I received some pretty devastating news. I found out the judge had made negative statements about me during my background investigation, that I wouldn't be able to obtain a security clearance, and that my job offer was being revoked. And then a couple of days later, the USAO extended an offer to interview for a different job with that office, and they revoked that too, based on the judge's same negative reference. At this point, I was 2 years into my legal career, and this judge seemed to have enormous power to ruin my career and destroy my reputation. So I filed a judicial complaint with the DC Commission on Judicial Disabilities and Tenure, hired attorneys, and in the summer and fall of 2021, participated in the investigation into the now former judge. And we were partway through that investigation when I found out separately from some attorneys who reached out to me privately that judge was on administrative leave pending an investigation into other misconduct at the time he'd filed the negative reference about me. The USAO wasn't alerted to that until January of 2022, when pursuant to the terms of our private settlement agreement, so separate from anything the judiciary could or would do for me, the former judge issued a clarifying statement addressing some but not all of his outrageous claims about me. But by then the damage had been done, and I'm pretty much blackballed from what I thought was my dream job. That summer, I became aware of proposed legislation called the Judiciary Accountability Act, which would extend Title VII to judiciary employees, including law clerks, enabling folks like me to sue our harassers and seek damages for harms done to our lives. Stayed in touch with House and Senate offices involved with drafting that bill. And when a hearing happened in March of 2022, I submitted written testimony for that, advocating for the legislation and an amendment to cover the DC courts, which is where I clerked. And then in the weeks following that, began to toss around some ideas for further advocacy work with my friend, WashU Law classmate, and now co-founder, Matt Goodman. And we eventually launched our nonprofit, the Legal Accountability Project, this past summer, June 1st, 2022.
Amazing. Well, I'm glad to hear. And I know you're pouring a lot of heart into this venture based on your own experiences. And now that we've learned a little bit more about your direction and how it came to be, how does that translate, giving back to your community and inspiring others to do the same?
Yeah, so I have a couple goals for the nonprofit in addition to the initiatives we're working on, which will protect the next generation of law clerks from workplace mistreatment and ensure that my clerkship experience is nobody else's clerkship experience. But it's larger than that. It is about changing the culture in the legal community from a toxic culture of silence, of deifying judges and disbelieving law clerks, to one of empowering law students to demand safer workplaces, one of inspiring former clerks to speak out about their negative clerkship experiences. And I just really want to foster, by sharing my story, sharing my experience, a culture of honest dialogue about the full range of clerkship experiences and honestly, the full range of employer-employee relationships on law school campuses and in other public forums.
And how can we support you and continue to pay it forward?
There's a couple things. Our website is legalaccountabilityproject.org, and folks can go there to sign up for our mailing list, donate to us, and support us. And we definitely appreciate that support. That will enable us to protect more law clerks from workplace mistreatment. If folks are inspired by my story and others like it, I think there's a couple other things they can do. If you are an attorney or a law student or a law clerk, it's about encouraging and empowering others around you to speak out about workplace mistreatment, to demand safer workplaces, to extract themselves from a negative situation. When I think back on my experience, lots of female attorneys told me the right professional decision would have been not to report, that speaking publicly would tarnish my reputation, and that I must have done something wrong because the judge hired me in the first place. That's all really toxic messaging. And everybody, whether you're an attorney or not, whether you clerked or not, can support somebody in a negative work environment.
And thank you for sharing your story and a little bit more about the nonprofit. We look forward to watching you grow and, happy to see this initiative and glad to have it featured. And we'd love to keep in touch and learn about your progress.
Thanks so much.
Thanks.